If you're building a financial product inside a non-financial brand, the legal question tends to show up late. The product is designed, the provider is picked, the first customer conversations are running, and then somebody asks whether you can actually launch it in the way you have built it. My guest today has sat on both sides of that conversation, first building and leading in-house legal teams, and now advising companies from the outside. And his view is that most of the pain comes from when legal gets involved, rather than from the law itself. Patrick Liptak is a partner at MYLE, a law firm in Berlin whose name stands for Making Your Life Easier. MYLE advises clients across a full spectrum, from early-stage startups through to listed companies, on IT law, data protection, and digitalisation projects. And the firm has picked up several accolades along the way. Patrick is also the first lawyer to sit on this podcast. And we recorded this one in person in a studio in Berlin-Neukölln, rather than over the usual video call. We get into why companies reach out to a lawyer in the first place, which in Patrick's experience is rarely a founder discovering out of nowhere that the product needs a license, and much more often a customer or an investor asking them to comply with something before the deal can close. From there, we talk about what he wants to see from a product team at the first conversation, why he argues that short contracts are harder to write than long ones, and how that connects directly to deal velocity, where he sees companies spending real money on platform tools that gives them compliance on paper and little else, what has happened to document quality since teams started drafting with AI, and why some startups are now putting their lawyer on the cap table. My name is Lars Markel, and I'm the founder of Embedded Finance Review, a newsletter, podcast, and event series covering the European embedded finance ecosystem. If you're working on an embedded finance project and want a free intro call to get feedback and meet the right providers and partners, head to embeddedfinancereview.com and request your slot. And now, let's dive in. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for actually meeting the first time in person.
That's indeed. And we are actually meeting in person. As the usual listeners know, typically I record my podcast virtually, but today is one of the few moments or the few recordings where I'm actually sitting right next to my guest. So Patrick and I, we're sitting here on a couch in Berlin-Neukölln in a recording studio and having the chance to chat about a topic of legal advice for fintechs and non-financial brands actually in person. And you made this happen. So thank you for setting this up for us.
Yeah, great to meet you, actually. Yeah, very cozy here. He's sitting right next to you.
Indeed. Patrick, my podcast is Embedded Finance Review. We talk about trends in, of course, embedded finance, fintech. We are really focused on the builders, people who are building financial products in their space. You're actually the first time a lawyer sits on my podcast. We know each other from your past. Maybe to introduce you and also the kind of work that you do, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and actually what kind of companies you're working with, and then we will dive deeper into our core topic from there.
Sure. So I'm a partner at MYLE. MYLE is a boutique law firm based in Berlin. I advise a wide variety of clients in the fintech space, from startup to scale up and also to larger companies, actually also some stock-listed companies. We also, on many occasions, act as DPO for companies and provide DPO services. And basically, I work as can you imagine, like a Swiss knife for companies. So when there's regulatory questions, they would bring us in and we would help to navigate through that.
And I mean, as I said, we had overlaps in certain projects in the past, and of course, and since then have been kept in touch. And I think the topic that I reach out to you quite often when you talk about is the whole legal advice for introducing new digital products. And it was actually the idea also here for the podcast to talk a little bit about that, which is of course quite relevant both for non-financial brands and fintechs when they're building new digital products, and then obviously at one point come to a point where they're wondering, okay, can I actually launch this product in the way that I build it? So maybe you can explain a little bit, because you're supporting quite a few companies in this regards, like when companies reached out to you for such support, how does it currently work? Like, why do they reach out to you, and what's the feedback you can give them at that point of time?
So normally what happens, they identify a need to comply with certain regulation. So there can be a couple of reasons, right? Either they are building a product and they already know, okay, this requires compliance, like a banking product, for example, right? Also, maybe they are seeking market acceptance. So clients tell them, okay, if you want to work with us, if you want to deliver a service, if you want to sell us a product, you need to comply with regulation XYZ. Sometimes you also have the situation when, of course, an investor, mainly from the US, would say, okay, I want you to comply with this standard or that standard. I require GDPR compliance. So that is something where then the need is identified. And based on that, then companies are usually quite confused, right? Because there's a lot of regulation in the EU and they have a tough time to navigate through all of that. I mean, we see it now. For example, many of our clients have a little bit of a headache with the EU AI Act because they are building products in that space and they seek a trusted advisor in that field. And this is usually where we would step in and where actually we can deliver the most value. So where a company actually also becomes a client then for us. And that is mainly because we all bring a lot of experience to the table when it comes to in-house experience. So I personally worked for many companies before I embarked on the journey with MYLE. So I used to build legal departments. I used to lead legal departments. So I would say I have a fair good understanding of how companies operate, especially startups and scale-ups in that specific field. And this is also where I would say we can speak the language of the companies. Then on top of that, we are very much interested in delivering advice at the same speed as the companies that seek our advice. So when this all comes together, I think that's a really good match because deal velocity is a number one thing for companies and we are really trying to facilitate that. So many of my clients are companies that I actually worked for in the past or where employees would set up their own startups and then they would seek our advice and reach out to us because we have already built a good relationship in the past. Yeah.
And you did mention the deal velocity, and I think it's quite interesting to dive a little bit deeper into that because also from my experience, when I worked in fintech companies or worked with financial brands, some of them have a legal counsel, a general counsel. Others work with maybe outside parties like yourself with MYLE now. And obviously, very often there's the positioning of this lawyer as my counterpart, my enemy in a way, like I built a product and now I need to convince the legal counsel to actually allow this product. And sometimes it gets a little bit of an environment where like, but I want this. And the lawyer says, no, you cannot do it. Especially with your background of having been inside of different fintechs and non-financial brands of building these products where you obviously, maybe today as well, but especially as an employee of the startup, obviously are quite interested as well to make the product work. Is there, you see like a different mindset that you and maybe other lawyers, the general counsel have towards like these building these products and bringing them out and not being the enemy, the opponent of the product teams to try to prevent everything and make everything 100% safe and boring, so to say?
Yeah, so that's a good point. What I would say depends a little bit also on the stage. So as a lawyer, if you get involved very early in the product development, because then you can help navigate much easier because things can be easily played back and forth a little bit, right? You can discuss ideas other than at the end of the product development cycle. And then you would just have to try to explain a certain risk, right? And if it should be taken or not, just express a legal opinion on something. Also, what happens sometimes is that where this really matters is when we are involved in contract negotiation, because, of course, you need to understand the product in order to negotiate the contract. And we would try to help with that because we really understand stakeholder needs. So if you act fast, if you know the product, if you have a certain expertise, that certainly helps. And internally, to answer your question on that one, in order to make the process as easy as possible for clients, it doesn't work without knowing the product. It doesn't work without having good relationships with the key stakeholders. So you need to understand how is someone from product thinking, how is someone from marketing thinking, how are the managing directors thinking, and how are they all interacting? And then you need to bring them somehow to the table and align those interests. And yeah, this is our job to navigate between all of them. And yeah, just really try to explain our views from a legal standpoint in this regard. Yeah.
So to put it in very plain, simple words, would be like, okay, as a product team, don't just like throw the final product in front of the lawyer, but help him or her to understand what you're trying to build, what you're trying to achieve, how you're doing it. And you did say earlier also in your previous, on the answer, involve the teams, or maybe involve the legal teams, maybe not at the very end, but even before. But I get it, but it sounds also complicated, right? Like especially with an outside legal counsel where it's also not cheap sometimes to involve these people. It's easier said than being done. Like, yeah, have them always by your side and explain what you're doing, how you're doing it. It's, in theory, it sounds nice, but in practice, it's probably a lot more complicated.
My number one advice with that would be build a demo. record a demo, have some click flows, send those over to a lawyer rather than just explaining very quickly what you're trying to do. Of course, sometimes I get a call, I'm asked for an opinion, we have to act fast, or it's just about brainstorming. But the best thing is you have a demo and you send this over, and then this can be reviewed at an early stage. It's always the best. And from there, you can advise much easier. So I get it, like sometimes the invest is not easy to make, but I always recommend it, especially if you want to play regulatory Champions League. If you want to play Champions League, you have to bring also A players to the pitch. It doesn't work otherwise very well.
So in a way, it's an investment that a company might have to take to spend the money on maybe hours with a legal advisor is being trained and educated about the product before actually giving the advice him or herself. But that's what you should ideally do. I think if you want to do the comparison nowadays with the AI tools, don't just like hack the prompt in there, but also tell them a little bit about yourself, about what you're trying to achieve. So there's a lot more context available. And I guess, same what we're doing with the AI tools, same as also with a legal advisor. I mean, if you just assume that he or she knows everything about your business and what you're trying to achieve and know all the complications that you have in the product building, if you share that, then you can.
Yeah, and I guess the most important part is also like talking to your audience now, right? Choosing a lawyer really depends on your needs. What's the maturity level of your company? What kind of advice are you seeking? Are you seeking, as I mentioned before, a Swiss knife that helps you to navigate early stage through all the different paths that are available? Or do you need a very specified legal opinion on a certain topic? Does this product require a license? Yes or no? And this is the only thing you want to know? Or is there something more? Like, how do I fulfill XYZ requirement? I mean, more, or should we maybe build the product differently because then we could take a different route? It really depends on your needs, and finding the right person for that is sometimes quite difficult.
And that sounds to me like maybe if you go a little bit deeper into the relationship you have with your clients, right? It doesn't really sound like that's a one-time off relationship with your clients. It's more about building the relationship, maybe starting with the first question, the first topic, and then going deeper from there, because obviously then you are probably being able to answer about new product launches much faster because you have a lot more context. And maybe while answering that question also, like when a company reaches out on the very first time to you to ask a specific question, like what is the answer you can typically give? And let's really focus on the topic of like building a new digital product. They come to you and like, hey, I want to build this new product. They show you the demo that you mentioned earlier. You discuss a few questions. What's typically the path ahead after you've learned about all these things and want to guide them on the next steps?
So usually, you mean after the product has been like discussed and we already built a strategy around that? Or, because what we usually would do is then we would strategize a little bit, right? We reviewed something or we discussed ideas, and then we would basically say, okay, it is smart to pursue this project, or maybe you should amend idea XYZ, or maybe we should explore a little bit more what is actually your target customer and what are the needs of your customer. Do you really want to fulfill XYZ regulation? Because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. You don't need to. Some clients have the misunderstanding they need to follow a certain industry standard, but they will never launch the product in that industry, as simple as it sounds, right? But apart from that, we would also help with the implementation of certain topics. So, for example, building lean contracts. The one point is you build an idea, you know how you should build it, but the other part is you need to translate that into contract. You need to translate that into your customer relationship somehow. And we would work on that together. So one of our core strengths is actually to build very lean contractual setups, because that again factors in when it comes to deal velocity. If you have very complicated contracts, if you have a contractual setup of 200, 300 pages because you are selling a service to a bank and you need a lot of addendums for all the different regulations out there, then that makes the process quite complicated and you want to be as fast as possible. So then we would prepare that. Or sometimes there are products that require approval by a works council. So we would prefer to prepare some sort of informational sheets already in the beginning. So we could send this over to a works council and negotiate then with the works council. So we would help to translate this all into paper, so to say. And then ideally, we would advise end-to-end. So we always advise end-to-end actually. So there's an idea, we discuss the idea, we review that, we advise on that. We build the contractual setup. And from there, this is then sent to a customer. And then what we would usually also do is we negotiate the contracts, not the commercials, right? There's something else. But when it comes to questions from a legal department, we would discuss this, sometimes with a data protection officer, with the information security officer, and then if required with the works council as well. So really end-to-end advice on all levels.
And I know this question depends a lot on type of clients and companies you work with, but is there often a surprise for your clients, for your customers when you come back with feedback? Like what I mean specifically thinking here around like launching a new product, and then the biggest surprise I could imagine is like, oh, you actually need a license for that, for the exact way you thought about like launching a product, which is obviously probably, if the company was not anticipating that, a very big surprise. Does something like this actually happen, or what are typically the feedbacks you can give to the companies based on the demo, the data flows, and all the things you got with them?
So usually it's not such a big deal because it doesn't happen a lot, because companies would already have that there is as I mentioned earlier, right, there is a compliance need, and for a certain reason they want to fulfill that need. So they're really looking for someone who helps them to deal with situation, rather than there's a big surprise of what they actually have to fulfill. It's more frustration, I would say, sometimes. Like, oh, do I really have to do this? Do I really have to do that? And that's quite burdensome. And there, I think it's very, very important that you try to find the leanest setup to ease the pain as much as possible. This is why I said also earlier, it's very important to strategize. And also maybe talking about risk for a moment, it is very important as a good advisor to point out risks and to help navigate those risks. Lawyers are usually very good at talking about problems, but also how big are those problems actually, right? You need to explain that a little bit, also to put that into perspective, and because companies need to make decisions in all kind of fields. They need to take risk-based decisions all the time, and we are there to help them to make those decisions. So of course there are some non-negotiables. If you need a license for certain services, it's criminal offense in Germany sometimes if you don't. So when I worked in crypto, this was a huge deal, right? Because we had the situation, still I have with some clients, legal uncertainty, and it's non-negotiable. You prefer to fulfill or maybe over-fulfill a little bit. But then there are things where you might decide, okay, I'm taking a different approach because it is uncharted territory, and let's just try it out. And we are there to put things into perspective.
And from what you said earlier, would you say you're 100% lawyer, or are you majority lawyer and also like digital product builder in a way, right? Because I mean, as you said before, right, this is, as a lawyer, and maybe the same also applies to some other professions, it's quite easy to play the easy card, so to say, and just say no. Like you have to do like 100% here, 100% there, 100% there, and then it's fine. But obviously, especially dealing with digital companies, not that they're wanting to avoid license, but surely not. But we all know there's a little bit of ambiguity in some of the areas, and sometimes you need also somebody who is maybe the expert at law, but also understands how things work in building digital products, right? So how would you describe your role in that regard?
That's a good one. Of course, my number one priority is that my clients succeed in what they do, right? And I really enjoy the journey with them. So especially this is why I love to work with startups or scale-ups, because besides all the legal topics that are quite interesting, because the IT law is such an interesting field, all the regulations out there, it's very interesting to discuss new topics that are emerging every day, right? Now with AI, for example, as well. But apart from that, especially in Berlin, there's a lot of talent. Now also in Munich as well, you work with extremely talented people, which is quite fun. And you get to work on those new business models. So ideally, the involvement at an early stage to really figure out things together, the process of that is fascinating for me, of course. And also I quite like the atmosphere when companies are really on edge and trying to achieve something with a lot of acceleration, rather than everything moving very slow. Sometimes you have to move slow. Okay, I understand it, of course. Sometimes things just take a little bit longer. And also from our side, sometimes things are not that easy. But I really like the mix of speed, talent, and new interesting legal topics. So yeah, in some sense, I would say building digital products, if I can contribute a little bit to that and to make our clients' life a little bit easier, yes, I enjoy that, yeah.
Makes sense. And you mentioned yourself the topic of AI, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but obviously it has changed quite a bit how companies work in general. And if we're looking at the legal advice side, have you seen with the companies you're working with a change? And I mean not referring to like you as a team using AI, but more your potential clients, customers using AI. Have you seen that they are now maybe a little bit more prepared for some of the discussion for the first chats with you because they have had additional ways of educating themselves? Or is that something where they maybe say, oh no, for legal advice, I anyway don't want to go down that road. I go directly to the expert and only rely on them? Or how do you see AI playing a role for these companies and these topics?
I would say at the moment, everything is still quite early stage. I have many clients that are building products around AI for sure, and they are seeking advice because they know that this is a field where they just need expert opinions. Otherwise, they will not succeed with their potential clients because otherwise they cannot create market acceptance. They want to have a top-notch setup in this regard because then they will massively ease the pain of closing a deal. So for them, it is very important. Even for many startups, they are now willing to invest into that. So I find that very interesting. What I see and what is now something that I still have to figure out with my clients is more the use of AI in the daily work because of course, they are trying out a lot to increase their business productivity. But for us as lawyers, when we receive certain documents that already have been drafted by AI or have been reviewed by AI, it is not very helpful actually. So there's like still a lot of friction, and this is like the benefit I have when I just text a message to a client and say, okay, can you please just send me the original doc and let me maybe figure this out in 5 minutes for you rather than we play back and forth via the AI.
Makes sense. Would you say this is quite a common thing nowadays that you see this, like the AI documents, or is it?
Yeah. You mean like that companies would build, for example, contracts with AI or compliance documentation with AI? Yes, we see that a lot, and it is a development I'm not very sure about if this will, of course, the quality gets better and better, but at the moment it is causing some frustration actually because we see that the quality of many documents has decreased actually, and that makes contract reviews much more painful because we then discover details that absolutely make no sense and just have been totally misplaced, and then we have to discuss that or we have to flag that, and that always makes a bad impression. So if you are a service provider and you have a documentation that at some point doesn't make any sense, then that doesn't create a lot of trust in the negotiation process, right? So that is something I'm trying to avoid, but of course there's now some aspects of where you can use AI very, very well actually. So for example, many use it to give direct access to their code base, and then they could seek certain information directly from the AI rather than you investing a lot of time to investigate, for example. And from that, you can actually build very good documentation. That is correct. But for hardcore legal documentation, I would say at least you have to double or triple check. Yeah.
Makes sense. And I was just like smiling quite a bit because I'm not sure if it's a fair analogy, but at home we just finished renovating our part of our apartment, including our bathroom, and we were looking at a specific shower to buy. And though the craftsman, we told him, okay, we want to buy this shower, and he looked at us and he was like, I hope you're not buying it just because of the price, because it's relatively cheap, because it will cost me double to install that one. At the end of it, you will pay and end up paying more than what you thought. So in a way, it will sound comparable to you. I think I'm going to save on legal fees, and because I'm involving AI and preparing a lot of documents. But at the end of it, when are these contracts that I have to talk to somebody else to sign the contract with, it might end up paying my lawyer a lot more because the negotiation about the contracts takes at the end of it a lot longer, for example.
I mean, cost is a huge discussion, and I get it for companies that they want to save costs. Of course, I absolutely understand it. The question is always, what is your transactional costs on a deal? Or this is how I would tackle it from a company perspective. So if you're closing an enterprise deal, 6 or 7 figures volume, it makes a lot of sense to invest a fraction of that into the actual legal setup around the deal, right? So I guess that is something just you have to weigh, and where you have to decide as a company, do you want to make that invest? And many companies actually, they just, or especially startups, they just get going, right? They start with an idea, they try things out, and then they see if it works or not. And what I would just advise, where I don't think that companies make good investments at the moment when it comes to compliance, is they invest into platform solutions that don't really work. So let's take the example of data protection, or let's take the example of information security. There's many platform providers that would just for a lot of money give you access to a platform, and there you have then the feeling, okay, I have some sort of on paper compliance with things, but they actually would need to invest a lot of time to figure things out to actually reach a certain level of compliance. And through the platform, they think they've reached that, and then they spend a couple of thousands of euros on this every year, and then they get the first audit, and then they say, okay, that doesn't really work, and then they would pivot from that, and then usually those are the clients then that reach out to us. Yeah.
Makes sense. And we spoke about, I think, a few areas already where you would say, like, okay, these are common mistakes. Do you see any other mistakes that fintechs, non-financial brands do when they're building like new digital products, or when it comes in general to legal advice?
Yeah, I would say, okay, apart from the platform, let's say also involving legal advice a bit too late, of course, because then it can get quite frustrating. Also getting the wrong advice, so to say, asking for the wrong things or getting the wrong advisor that doesn't really fit the company need, because it is sometimes just too late if you're just very close to closing a deal and then it's like, the client just pointed out we would have to comply with XYZ and you're like, okay, I never thought about this. Then also the lawyer can't help with that, right? I should have thought about this a bit earlier, unfortunately. Apart from that, reducing friction as much as possible. So let's call it a good legal UX. That is something what I constantly try to enable is very simple flows. So wherever possible, we would reduce friction from a legal perspective. So for example, what I mentioned with the lean contracts, you don't need a 200-page contract. When it comes to contractual mechanisms, in regulated industries, we have a lot of notification mechanisms for all different kind of regulations. There we would try to merge many of those processes and try to set up as lean as possible. That is one thing that I can highly advise. Make your contracts as simple as possible. And that requires very deep legal knowledge. So we talked about AI, right? You cannot build a very, very simple contract with an AI. I think you can, but it is quite risky. So to make short contracts, you need very good lawyers. But yeah, that's definitely a number one thing. And then do not underestimate the importance of risk management. So I think to have a lawyer that enables you to take informed risk-based decisions is very, very important early stage, because then you can navigate fast. Otherwise, you will only be afraid of doing things. And again, as I said, there are some non-negotiables, but always try to find a balanced approach. Try to find someone who can truly explain things to you so you understand them and make your decisions based on that. And I think then you have the perfect mix of moving your business forward, having a fairly compliant product that is accepted by the market and where you can make good business. I think this is the best mix, yeah.
So it does sound to me like the teams who are building these products or in charge of these decisions obviously have to find the right legal advice out there, building a relationship, continuously involving that person in product development. And would you say all of this is changing at the moment? Is there now also, I don't know, like a new way of like how teams work together with external legal advisors?
So I can only say like how I experience it with my clients at the moment. And I'm also taking a little bit of a different approach than maybe other lawyers do, but I'm very much embedded into the daily work of my clients. With many of my clients, I talk on a very regular basis, and they can basically call me via the medium of their choice whenever they want. If they want me to use a certain system, I use this certain system, this a certain infrastructure, just to make their lives as easy as possible. So that is obviously not possible with a law firm that charges you 1,200 euros an hour, like Big Law. Of course, we try to structure also our compensation around that, so it's a good win-win for both sides. What I also see, what's currently a trend, and I can also highly recommend it, is that startups, especially, they would try to get lawyers or they convince them to invest into a seat ticket to give them a place at the cap table, because that then creates also a different incentive and also a different amount of involvement.
But have you seen it quite often recently? Or?
It is a trend, I would say. It's not that well established, but I think it's quite helpful actually to do that, because then you also have a different relationship with your lawyer.
Quite a bit, I guess, right?
Yeah, so that helps. I think I can recommend that, yeah. So yeah, all in all, I think there's a trend definitely towards seeking personal relationships and highly specialized opinions. So especially in the highly regulated industries, companies are outsourcing this more and more to highly specialized lawyers that they have a very personalized relationship with, yes.
Interesting. Patrick, is there anything we missed? Anything that any final advice for the builders out there who listen to this? We in the half an hour went through the topic of like building digital products and legal advice. Obviously, a very complicated and complex topic, and to fit it into a podcast not always easy. But is there anything do you think we have missed?
I would say start navigating early. Don't invest into bullshit on paper compliance. Find the right lawyer and just go for it.
Perfect closing words. Thanks so much, Patrick, for joining. If there's a listener out there who thinks like, okay, this sounded really interesting, I want to learn more, maybe chat with you, what's a good way to find you or reach out to you?
Any medium of choice, LinkedIn, our website. People can call me on my phone. It doesn't really matter. Anything works. Yeah.
Perfect. I'll make sure to add your LinkedIn link in the show notes so people can reach out to you directly there. Again, thank you, Patrick. And yeah, thanks for joining.
Amazing. Yeah. The time has passed by so quickly, actually. I'm surprised. But yeah, thanks. It was quite some fun. Yeah.
Thank you for joining. Until next time. Thank you for listening. I hoped you enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure to follow the Embedded Finance Review podcast in your favorite podcasting app. And if you know somebody with an interesting story to tell about embedded finance, preferably in Europe, please let me know. Until next time.